had been delivering for a popular food delivery service for about 6 months by the time this happened. It was a pretty good gig. Decent money, flexible hours. Most of the time, the orders were straightforward. Pick up the food, drop it off, maybe exchange a few words with the customer, and then off to the next delivery. But one night, I had an experience that still sticks with me to this day. It was a Friday night, and I was about halfway through my shift, picking up orders from all over the city. The weather was decent, not too cold, so I was in a good rhythm. Around 10 p.m., I got a notification for a delivery from this small Chinese takeout place I liked. I swung by, picked up the order, and checked the drop-off address. It was in this older part of town, where the houses are more spread out, and the streets are quieter. It wasn't an area I delivered to very often, but I figured it would be an easy ride. The drive took about 15 minutes, and the further I got from the more populated areas, the darker and quieter it became. The streetlights were few and far between, and most of the houses were set far back from the road, partially hidden by trees and bushes. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood you'd want to break down in late at night. I followed the GPS, and it led me to a long, narrow driveway. The house was set way back from the street, almost like it was tucked away in the woods. I couldn't even see the house from the road, just the shadowy outline of a mailbox and a gravel path leading into the darkness. I hesitated for a second, but figured it was just an old, secluded house. People live in weird places sometimes, so I didn't think too much of it. I turned down the driveway, the sound of gravel crunching under my tires as I slowly made my way up the long path. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the house. It was a large 2-story building, but it was old, really old. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the porch light was flickering like it was barely hanging on. It had this eerie, abandoned vibe, but I saw a light on inside, so I figured someone must be home. I parked and grabbed the food from the passenger seat. As I got out, I felt this strange stillness in the air. It wasn't just quiet. It was asterisk, silent asterisk. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the faint hum of my car engine. The whole place felt off. I walked up to the porch, which creaked under my feet, and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and waited. Still nothing. I double-checked the address on my phone to make sure I was in the right place. Yep, this was the house. Just as I was about to knock again, I heard the faint sound of footsteps from inside. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was shuffling toward the door. I waited, my hand still raised to knock, but the door didn't open. Instead, I heard a voice from the other side. "Leave it on the porch." The voice was quiet, raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in a while. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but something about it made my skin crawl. I cleared my throat and said, okay, sure. I'll just leave it here." I set the bag down on the porch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Usually, people come to the door, even if they ask for no contact delivery. But whoever was inside just waited. I turned to leave, but as I stepped off the porch, I heard the door creak open behind me. I froze, not turning around right away, but I could feel eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Then, that same raspy voice said, "Wait." I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. Slowly, I turned around, and I saw the door slightly ajar, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of whoever was inside. But what I saw didn't make any sense. Standing in the shadows of the doorway was a figure, tall and thin, but their face was obscured, like they were standing just out of the light. But what really freaked me out was their hand, which was gripping the edge of the door. It was pale, almost gray, and looked unnaturally long, like the fingers were stretched too far. "I forgot something," the voice said again, even quieter this time, almost a whisper. "Come closer." Every instinct in my body told me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I don't know if it was the voice or the way the figure moved, but something about them felt wrong. Like they didn't belong in that house. Like they didn't belong anywhere. Without thinking, I mumbled something like, I have other deliveries," and turned back to my car. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I didn't dare look back as I started the engine and backed down that long driveway, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. As soon as I got back to the main road, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But the entire drive back to town, I couldn't stop thinking about that house, about that voice, and the figure standing in the doorway. I never went back to that part of town again, and whenever I drive at night, I always make sure the addresses are somewhere well lit and populated. Because whatever I delivered to that house that night, it wasn't just a person. And I'm not sure I ever want to know who or what was behind that door. It was a cold, rainy night. One of those nights where you wish you were anywhere but outside, especially driving through the streets soaked in that dreary mist. I had been working delivery for a couple of hours and was ready to call it quits. But then I got one last ping. It was for a delivery from a 24-hour diner I'd been to a few times. So I figured, why not? Just one more, and I could head home. I picked up the order, 2 burgers, fries, and a milkshake. Nothing unusual. The drop-off was about 20 minutes away, in an area I wasn't super familiar with, but figured was just one of those quiet neighborhoods on the edge of the city. As I drove, the rain picked up, and the fog started rolling in thick, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. I turned down a long, narrow road that led deeper into the outskirts. The houses were spaced farther and farther apart, and the trees on either side loomed over the street, their branches bending in the wind like they were reaching out to grab my car. The GPS was guiding me toward this house that seemed to be out in the middle of nowhere. After a few turns, I found myself on a gravel road that led up to a large, old Victorian-style house. It stood out like something from a different time, tall and dark, with the kind of architecture that felt both beautiful and haunted. The house wasn't run down exactly, but it had this eerie vibe, like it had been untouched by time, yet still very much alive in its own way. The porch light was on, casting a dim, yellow glow across the front steps, but the rest of the house was dark. No lights on inside, no signs of movement, just the soft sound of rain tapping on the roof. I parked the car and grabbed the food, heading up to the porch. There was a chill in the air, and I felt the cold seep into my bones. I knocked on the door and waited. A minute passed. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Your food's here." Still nothing. I glanced at my phone to double-check the address. Yep, this was the right place. Just as I was about to set the food down and leave, the door creaked open slowly. But no one was there. The door just opened. I stared at the dark doorway, the rain drumming on the roof of the porch as I stood frozen, holding the bag of food. "Hello?" I called out, leaning slightly toward the opening. Nothing. Just silence and the occasional creak of the wind pushing through the trees. I thought maybe someone had opened the door and stepped away for a moment. So I stepped closer to the threshold and peeked inside. The hallway beyond the door was dimly lit by a flickering candle, of all things, sitting on a small table by the entrance. The rest of the house was swallowed in shadow. I was about to set the food down right there and leave when I heard it. Footsteps coming from deeper inside the house. They echoed in the silence, and soon after, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing an old, faded robe. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his hair was gray and messy, as if he hadn't cared for his appearance in a long time. He moved slowly, like he was conserving energy, but his eyes, they were wide and alert, like he hadn't slept in days. He stopped just short of the candlelight and looked at me, almost like he was surprised to see me standing there. "I, have your food," I said, holding up the bag and trying to sound casual, even though I could feel the tension creeping up my spine. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring at me. Then, in this low, gravelly voice, he said, "You're not supposed to be here." I blinked. I'm just here for the delivery." I gave a nervous laugh, trying to break the awkwardness, but he didn't laugh back. He just kept staring at me with those unsettling eyes. For a long moment, we stood there in silence. I wasn't sure if I should just leave the food and go, or wait for him to take it. Finally, he stepped forward and took the bag from my hand. But as he did, his fingers brushed mine, and they were ice cold, like he had been standing outside in the rain for hours, even though I knew he hadn't. I was about to turn and walk away when he said, almost in a whisper, "She doesn't like visitors." I froze again. "Who doesn't?" I asked, before I could stop myself. He didn't answer, just turned and walked back into the shadows of the house, leaving the door wide open behind him. I stood there for a second, unsure of what to do, before quickly backing away and heading to my car. The whole time, I could feel this strange pressure in the air, like I was being watched, but not just by him. Something else, something I couldn't see but knew was there, was lurking in the darkness of that house. I jumped in my car, slammed the door shut, and drove off as fast as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. As I pulled away from the house and back onto the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the porch. But there was no one. Just that house, sitting there in the rain, the door still wide open, as if waiting for someone, or something, to come inside. I never delivered to that house again. In fact, I avoided that whole area from then on. And every time I think about that night, I can't help but wonder, who was he talking about? And what, or who, was watching from the shadows? Whatever the answer, I'm just glad I didn't stick around to find out. It was a slow Tuesday night, and I had been driving around for hours, hoping to catch more orders. The dinner rush had come and gone, and now I was just trying to squeeze in a few more deliveries before calling it a night. Just when I was about to head home, I got a ping from a pizza place downtown. It was an easy pickup, and the drop-off was only a few miles away, so I figured I'd take it. I drove to the pizza shop, grabbed the order, and checked the address on the app. It was in a part of town I didn't usually go to, an older neighborhood full of large, old houses that probably used to be grand, but had fallen into disrepair over the years. I didn't think much of it at the time, though. I just wanted to finish the delivery and head home. I followed the GPS, and after a few turns, I found myself on this narrow, winding street lined with trees that seemed to block out most of the streetlights. The houses were big, but many of them looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and overgrown yards. The kind of place where you can tell time has forgotten about it. The house I was delivering to was one of the few that still seemed occupied. It was a large, old Victorian-style home with peeling paint and ivy creeping up the sides, but the porch light was on, and a couple of dim lights were glowing inside. I parked at the curb and grabbed the pizza, making my way up the creaky steps to the front door. There was something about the place that felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but as I stood there, pizza in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. The air was still, heavy, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I knocked on the door and waited. A minute passed, then another. I knocked again, louder this time, but there was still no answer. I was about to leave the pizza on the doorstep when I heard the door slowly creak open. It didn't open all the way, just enough for me to see part of the interior and a sliver of whoever was standing inside. Through the crack in the door, I saw a hand. It was pale, almost ghostly white, and the fingers were long and thin, like they hadn't seen the sun in years. The hand rested on the edge of the door, unmoving, as if the person was hesitant to open it fully. "Delivery," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The door opened a little wider, and I caught a glimpse of the person standing behind it. It was a woman, maybe in her 50s or 60s, with long, graying hair that hung loose over her shoulders. Her skin was as pale as her hand, and her eyes, those were what got me. They were wide and glassy, staring at me like she was seeing right through me, or like she hadn't seen another person in years. "Thank you," she said, in a voice so soft, I almost didn't hear her. She stepped forward just enough to take the pizza from my hands. As she did, I couldn't help but notice how cold the air around her felt, like a sudden drop in temperature, even though it wasn't that cold outside. I was about to turn and leave when she spoke again, her voice still quiet, but with a strange edge to it. "You shouldn't be out so late," she said, her eyes still locked on mine. "Not around here." I stopped, confused. Yeah, I'm just finishing up for the night," I said, trying to brush off the weirdness of the situation. But she didn't seem to hear me. She just stood there, holding the pizza, still staring at me with those unsettling eyes. After a long, uncomfortable pause, she said, "It's not safe. Not after dark." I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I just nodded awkwardly and started backing away toward my car. She watched me the whole time, not moving, just standing in the doorway with the pizza in her hands. As I reached my car, I heard the door creak shut behind me, but the sound echoed in my head, making the silence afterward feel even heavier. I got into my car and quickly pulled away from the house, the feeling of unease lingering long after I left the neighborhood. Something about the way she said, "It's not safe," stuck with me, like she knew something I didn't. As I drove through the dark, empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like there were eyes in the shadows, just out of sight. Every turn I took, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the distant glow of streetlights. I made it home without incident, but the whole experience left me on edge. I don't know if it was the woman, the house, or just the eerie vibe of that part of town. But something about that delivery didn't sit right with me. The next morning, out of curiosity, I decided to check the delivery app to see if I could find any reviews or past orders from that address. But when I pulled up the history, something weird happened. The delivery wasn't there. It was like the order had never existed. No record of it, no payment, nothing. It was as if I had imagined the whole thing. I tried to convince myself it was just some glitch in the system, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That house, that woman, the way she had looked at me, it all felt too real to just be a mistake. Ever since that night, I've avoided that part of town. Whatever was going on at that house, I don't want to know. Some deliveries are better left forgotten.